prion disease. It's a relatively rare group of diseases. They're all transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, so TSEs. Human TSE includes Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD, variant CJD, Kuru, and fatal familial insomnia. Animal TSEs, that includes things like scrapie, which is in sheep, and bovine spongiform encephalopathy, which you may know as mad cow disease. Variant CJD, it is a prion disease with a genetic component linked with the bovine spongiform encephalopathy, the mad cow disease. Signs and symptoms. You're going to see things like altered behavior, memory loss, impaired senses, delirium, senility. It almost looks like they're going through Alzheimer's disease, the symptoms of Alzheimer's. Human transmissible spongiform encephalopathies always result in death. There's nothing you can do. If you get prion disease, you have it, and that's it. So pathogen info. Prions have no genetic material. They're not a virus. They're not a bacteria. They're not a eukaryote. They're not a worm. They're not a fungus. They're actually a protein. It isn't even an organism. It doesn't have genetic material at all. And they work by taking the prion proteins that we have that are normal and causing them to change their shape. Okay. So prion disease was one of those diseases that was really hard to diagnose initially because they were looking for something like a virus that has genetic material that can manipulate your cells and cause cell death, or a bacteria or a fungus. They were looking for something that had a code that would allow them to do these things. That wasn't what happened. So prion proteins are in your body, and they have a very specific shape to them. And in this shape, the right shape, they're fine. They do their job. There's no harm, no foul to your body. If, however, you get a misshapen prion protein, and no, we don't know why this happens. If you get a misshapen protein into your body, you eat mad cow meat or something like that, your proteins, for some reason, start to take on the shape of the misshapen prion. And when that happens is when damage happens. The scary part about this, there is no way to kill prions in a person. And to be honest, even on a petri dish, prions are really hard to kill. You can soak them in bleach, they'll still be there. You can set them on fire, they'll still be there. You can, put them in Lysol, they'll still be there. You can put them in an autoclave, they'll still be there. There is literally only one way to kill prions, to destroy them, and it involves putting them into a very specialized incinerator that gets hotter than normal incinerators do. Prions are scary just for the fact that there's no way to get rid of them. If they are somewhere, unless you're doing something really special, they're staying there. Unless you're putting a whole, let's say, countertop into a special incinerator, it's going to stay there. Because none of the normal things that we think of as killing a pathogen work with prions. Oh yes, if you irradiate them, still there. Pathogenesis, how do we get it? Prions are somehow transmitted to humans or passed along as a heritable trait. In other words, it's in your genome. Creutzfeldt-Jakob is a genetic mutation that causes prions in people. That starts changing our normal brain PRP proteins, or normal prion proteins, into the abnormal proteins. What this ultimately does is it causes plaques to form in our brain. It causes damage in our brain. Treatment, nothing. Prevention, we don't know. It depends. When mad cow came about in the 90s, I think it was, one of the only reasons they linked it to this was the population of people that they were seeing Alzheimer's developing in. It was people in their 20s, people in their 30s, which is not normal. And they finally figured out what was happening. And when they finally figured out what was happening, they were like, oh. But again, that was just one case. If people show up with prion disease, it's not necessarily because they ate a bad cow. It varies. There isn't necessarily just one specific, this is how you get it. So saying this is how you prevent it, if we don't know how you got it, we don't know how to prevent it. The only, I guess, successful version of that was when mad cow hit in the 90s and they traced it back to ranches that had cows that had mad cow. Here's the normal prion. This is what we want in our brain. Here's the disease-causing one. See the the 3 alpha helices. This one has this weirdness here that isn't over here. There's this chain reaction, like I said. You get your normal prion near the mutated prion, and all of a sudden it changes its shape. And you end up with all of these prions that are the wrong shape, causing damage in the brain. This is a healthy brain. This is somebody that does not have prion disease. Look at how big the spaces are, like they've lost brain tissue because it has died off. Here, I've got very little space. Here, not only has the brain shrunk, but these spaces have gotten bigger because the parts around them have shrunk down. This is brain damage. And remember, your brain is your CPU to run your body. If you damage it enough, your body's not going to work anymore. If I set a computer on fire and damage the CPU, it's not going to work either. Same. Rabies. This is a zoonosis. A zoonosis is a disease mainly in animals, but it can be transmitted to humans. Rabies is everywhere. It's worldwide. It's not only in one specific place. So where do we see it? Well, the reservoir for the most part is going to be wild animals. Top reservoirs include rabies-infected dogs. Bats are a really, really big one. If you see a bat, never ever touch it because there's a real good chance it has rabies. Raccoons, foxes, skunks. The reservoir can also be varied based on geographical location. For example, dogs aren't really a reservoir in the United States. Why? Because we give our dogs rabies shots, so they don't necessarily get it. Transmission is direct contact. You have to be bitten by a virally infected animal. The virus ends up in really, really high numbers in the saliva, so when they bite you, they transfer the virus into your body. If you've ever seen even just pictures of a rabid dog, they foam at the mouth. That's because their salivary glands have tons of virus in them. Signs and symptoms. Incubation can be 1 to 2 months, even up to a year. The initial symptoms include kind of non-specific things. I have fever, I'm nauseous, I'm vomiting, I have a headache, I'm tired. As the disease progresses, those symptoms include personality changes, tremors, you shake, hydrophobia, which is literal fear of water. People who are in the advanced stages of rabies are thirsty. They want water so bad. But when you get water near them, they completely flip out. Hydrophobia, they're literally afraid of water. Even a bottle of water, they freak out. Cases almost always end in death. If you go without treatment, it's 100% fatal. I mentioned that previously. So the pathogen is the rabies virus. It enters a puncture site through a bite, through the infected animal's saliva, and it remains in that site for about a week. The virus eventually enters the nerve endings, goes to the central nervous system, and it ends up in your brain, travels to other organs until ultimately it reaches the salivary glands. And like I said, this is where it's shed. If they bite you, you get the saliva in the wound, you now have rabies. Treatment. If you are bitten, there is a post-exposure immunization with a rabies vaccine. The problem, if you wait and it has had time to get past the I'm sitting in the bite stage and I go to the nerves, I attach to the nerves, there's nothing they can do. At that point, there is no treatment for you. It's done. Prevention. Stay away from wild animals. High-risk groups need to be vaccinated against rabies. If you are working with domesticated animals, if you are working with animals in general, if you are working at the pound, if you're working as an animal control specialist, you need to get vaccinated before you go out. It's a safety thing, and it's your safety we're talking about. It's not safety for the animals. This is to prevent you from getting it. Most people don't have such a high risk of encountering something with rabies. But if you're animal control, the amount of contact you have with animals, your chance is pretty significant. So getting the vaccination ahead is a lot safer for you. That's the rabies virus. Before symptoms begin, you can do the prophylactic intervention that may prevent the disease. You can go and you can get the vaccination. Usually the incubation is about 20 to 60 days, but after that you start to see the symptomology starting off. Once that symptom train begins, there's nothing that they can do. It's too late. In the prodromal stage, again, you've got those kind of non-specific symptoms. I'm super tired. I'm just not very energetic. I have a headache. I may have like a low-grade fever. I do have pain close to the site of the exposure. But when we get into clinical symptoms, you can have encephalitic rabies, fluctuating consciousness, phobic spasms, the hydrophobia, being afraid of water, autonomic dysfunction. Your pupils will expand and contract and expand and contract, and it isn't due to the exposure to the light. And you get that hypersalivation. I start making huge amounts of saliva. In paralytic rabies, you're going to see somebody who's going to be completely paralyzed. They can't move anymore. So instead of having this kind of hyper function, now you've got somebody who just paralyzed. Tetanus. It's a disease known as lockjaw. It is relatively rare in the United States because we have the tetanus shot. The reservoir, where do you find it? You find it in the soil. People think it's rusty nails, but it's not. It's the soil that's sitting on the rusty nails. Transmission route are organisms or their endospores that are introduced into the body via puncture. They can be introduced via frostbite. They can even be introduced via burns. Symptoms that are caused by the toxin action, it leads to paralysis. Initial symptoms will include clenching of the jaw, which is why they call it lockjaw, because you, with your jaw, arching of the back, because your back muscles start to contract. Later symptoms, opisthotonos. There's no control of the muscles. All are basically majorly contracting. They're all tightening. And the lockjaw stays. Death will eventually occur due to paralysis of your respiratory system. Back in the day when there was no treatment for this, they used to watch this happen. They would watch it progress, and they would know eventually they're going to suffocate to death. because the muscles that help them to breathe are also going to be paralyzed. And there was nothing they could do. If you were a person who had this and you understood what it was, you knew it was coming, which is awful. I couldn't even imagine. Clostridium tetani is an anaerobic bacterium that commonly forms endospores, and it produces a very powerful neurotoxin, tetanospasmin. We talked about this. You can step on a nail, it gets into your foot, but then this is the toxin that's getting produced that travels to your spinal cord. Organisms or spores enter through a wound. The spores return to their vegetative state, their active state. As the organism grows, tetanospasmin is made and released into the infection site, and it binds to motor nerve endings, then travels to the spinal cord. That's when symptoms start to show. Treatment. If the patient receives the tetanus vaccine immediately after the presence of the puncture, some protection can be provided. Once the clinical symptoms begin, you can give them antitoxin, like antivenom. You can give them antitoxin therapy. You can attempt it. However, once the toxin actually attaches to the nerve endings, you're done. There's nothing you can do. Prevention. You want to get your tetanus toxoid vaccine. When you get it, that vaccine lasts for 10 years. You get it 10 years later so that it lasts another 10 years. This is probably the most famous image of somebody that actually had this that progressed all the way to the muscles contracting. You can see his hands are in fists. You can see his toes are bent. You can see the grimace on his face. And that bowing of his body is because all of his muscles have contracted. This is Clostridium tetani. That's the thing that causes this. Again, you get a puncture somewhere. You can see the grimace on his face. You can see that bowing of the body. And in this case, his hands are open because it's the other muscles up here that are contracting. Even his toes are pointing up. Botulism. It's a disease known as an intoxication. It's not the organism that causes the disease, it's the toxin that causes the disease. It's associated with poorly preserved foods, but can also cause wound infections. The reservoir, soil and marine sediment. Transmission route, it's usually through vehicles. Most of the time when we see botulism in patients, it's because they had bad food. It can be direct contact as well, though, with like wounds. If we're talking about the marine sediment, that can be direct contact with an open wound. Causes have declined in the past decades, basically due to modern food preservation. We have a lot more advanced ways to prepare food so that we don't get this infection. Does it still happen? Yes, but not as often as it used to. Signs and symptoms. Early symptoms will include things like double vision, difficulty swallowing, and dizziness. Later symptoms. You've got this descending muscular paralysis known as flaccid paralysis. Basically, instead of muscles contracting like you see with lockjaw, now they're flaccid. They don't contract at all. Death results, again, from paralysis of the respiratory system. Clostridium botulinum is an anaerobic bacterium that commonly forms endospores. The types associated with human disease are going to be A, B, E, and F. It produces, like I said, a powerful exotoxin, which is botulinum toxin, and it is responsible for those symptoms that we see down there. The pathogenesis. The organism enters the body, it produces the toxin, or the toxin can enter the body alone. It attaches to nerve cells and the symptoms begin to show. Treatment, antitoxin can be administered promptly. Just like with other things, if it's progressed to the point that the exotoxin is attached to a nerve cell, this isn't going to work. You have to catch it early. Prevention, food hygiene, toxoid vaccination for lab professionals that are actually working with Clostridium botulinum. If you know that you work with this, getting a vaccination is preventative, it's prophylactic. You're getting it just in case. So that is Clostridium botulinum. This baby has been exposed and gotten the botulinum toxin in such high amounts that he's paralyzed. He doesn't lift his head, his arms and legs are just dangling. This is what it looks like. And the signs and symptoms include things like blurred vision, double vision, drooping eyelids, facial paralysis, dry mouth and throat. You can have difficulty swallowing because the muscles there are not working. Tachycardia, your heart starts kind of misbehaving. Respiratory paralysis, nausea and vomiting, muscle weakness, abdominal distension because your muscles aren't holding it anymore. You can also end up with problems urinating because you don't have control of that smooth muscle to push the urine out, or even constipation where you can't really move your intestines anymore. Now, Botox. This is Botox. When people talk about getting Botox, yeah. If I get wrinkles, I get wrinkles. That's the way I see it, and I'm pretty sure I have wrinkles. But I'm not getting Botox because if somebody who doesn't know what they're doing injects this stuff into me, they can kill me. So yeah. Botox works off of the principle that you are going to paralyze the muscles so that they're not scrunching anymore and causing wrinkles. That's why when somebody gets Botox, they kind of look plastic and it looks like they can't make facial expressions because they literally can't. The muscles are paralyzed. But like I said, the problem is if somebody gives it to you that doesn't know what they're doing, what if it travels around your body? What if it gets into your bloodstream and travels to some other part that can really cause damage? Pass.